And while we're still having people come in, we'll get rolling here in just a moment.
From Josh, yes, my company is comprised of engineers, and accountants.
Of course, Josh, if
We're
you're going to
familiar with
have
this.
engineers and accountants, will not be deterred.
Yeah.
They want to see some numbers. That totally makes sense.
Yep, both. Yeah, thanks, Axel. Both in small and large projects. Yep, we've run into this as well. Yeah, Catherine's saying not sure.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for that. And we'll just get ourselves moving along here. So we'll be talking about some work that Roxanne and I've done around how to come up with a calculation to actually calculate the ROI of change. And we're no kidding, we're going to share an equation with you on how to do it. But we'll also talk about some of the nuances of that as well, and a few pitfalls. So hopefully a little bit more robust than just, hey, here's an equation, go make the calculation and see what you come up with. Because we know it's not as simple as that. And we've expanded a bit. So there are some of you on who may have seen this or this presentation that we've done last year, and we've have some additions. So I've gotten some feedback from folks and have learned some, of course, on our own as well, and try to put all this in here for you. So I'm looking forward to sharing all that. And this is part of the series that we're doing, really two series of webinars that we'll be doing every month for this year. We had some of these last year and have added in some new ones this year. So here we are in January, calculating a change ROI, and you can see on the left, we have a whole series of analytics, change analytics based webinars that we'll be doing, usually on the second Thursday of the month. And then the fourth Thursday, we'll be doing ones that are more leadership oriented. And you can see some of those on the right-hand side. So we hope you guys can join us for some of those in the future. And we're looking forward to continuing just build out our content and capability around it. So I love getting the feedback from people and hearing their questions, because that just spurs us on to go do the next thing and the next thing and to try and learn more. So thank you for all of those. And we're glad that you guys were able to join us today. So we're going to turn it over to Roxanne to kind of start with, why are we doing this at all?
Yeah, so when I was an internal change practitioner for nearly 2 decades, this was my experience. I think it was maybe a lot like yours, Josh. I worked for an organization filled with engineers, not quite accountants, but definitely financial related brains. And so I was always looking for some sort of return on investment calculation for change management. And then when I was the president of the Association of Change Management Professionals, I heard it from the membership, especially when we had our annual in-person conference. It was this rally cry that I would hear from the participants. We needed ROI for change management. And for some of you who are familiar with those conferences, those in-person conferences, that may sound familiar to you. So we were very motivated to come up with an equation that we could share with other people, because it was obviously beyond my personal experience when I noticed that other people were looking for this. So before we jump into the equation, we wanted to share just a quick thing about Joy at Work, which is our motivation for the work that we do in change management. We think that change professionals have a unique position to bring joy to the workplace, because they help people make sense of what's going on in highly stressful, emotionally charged, politically charged change situations. So we believe that how you introduce change really matters to the culture. So we've done a lot of research. You can see a few things here that we've done. And then we have, if you go to the next slide, we think of Joy at Work as not rainbows and unicorns, but really about creating the conditions to help people thrive, especially in times of change. So pretty straightforward. When we did our research, we came up with this definition, which is on the next slide. It's really a two-way street. It's about Joy at Work being employee willingness to behave in these ways, be committed, accountable, trust, belong, and act with cohesion, adapt, All of these different dimensions have come up, but it's a two-way street. As I say, it's not just the company leaders and managers that create these conditions and invite employees to contribute this way, but employees have to accept this invitation. So, you can understand this, right? So you can certainly create the conditions for this, but if an employee doesn't accept the invitation, then it doesn't work. And vice versa. If you're an employee and you are willing to behave in these ways and contribute in these ways, but if the company doesn't value it, you're sort of stuck. It's hard to get traction. It's certainly hard to experience joy at work. So what does this have to do with change? Just as I said, if you go to the next slide, how we approach change directly impacts the culture. And we often talk about OCM in terms of process and tools and templates, right? Which is really helpful for leaders when we're trying to explain to them what the work is. But if we find ourselves in that internal strife situation, especially if the people on the project team are struggling, you can find yourself in the wilderness. So we think about how do we talk about things like psychological safety in the context of change? Anyway, that's just kind of a background on joy at work and how we connect it to change. And we wanted to share that with you before going into the equation, because that shows up in how we do the calculation.
Yeah, and our desire to really get beyond just even the basic business case that's there and think about the culture. So what is the impact that you're having on the overall culture of the organization as you are doing the change initiative? And that matters. I mean, you guys know that. You've experienced that, I'm sure, that the change initiative itself is not in its own little bubble. It actually has an impact more broadly on the culture. So where we're going to go is to take a look at what's happening with business cases and how this whole ROI thing fits inside the business case. And then we're going to get to the actual measure. How do you think about measuring change broadly, but very specifically, how do you calculate the return on investment? And then we'll finish just a little bit about presentations and just how to tell the story of the return on investment coming from change so that it can be done in a compelling way and actually be convincing for people, especially people that are pretty hardcore analysts. They're going to want to be able to see that sort of stuff and know for sure what's going on. So in this case, we're really going to look a little bit about how they're being used and what does this mean for managing change. And so this kind of comes to this first spot here. Is a business case real? Is it a fact or is it kind of a fantasy? And I think those are probably clear why people would ask those things, because business cases pop up and sometimes they go on the shelves and no one's paying attention to them. And if they're not realized, people will say nasty things about them being made up. But I think it's really better to think about them as a prediction. It's just your best understanding of what's going on at the time, and you try and put that together so that you can plan around it. But what we would suggest is that you're constantly making an update to it. So as you get new information, you make that sort of an update, because if you don't, if you just stay fixed, and you're talking about things where you may have put a business case together and it could be, the project could be 9 months or 18 months or even longer. And if you've never made an update, then really what you're checking is how good are you at making long-term predictions? You're not really using that as a tool to help you to be successful with any kind of business effort, let alone what's going on with the change component of that business effort. And you guys have seen these, I'm sure, basic sort of components that wrap around a business case. Some sort of a summary that is in there for what the effort is all about, problem statement, this is what's not where we want it to be or even what's broken. And then the analysis section tends to be the bigger part of the business case. We actually do the calculations and talk about what the return is going to be and why do you want to do this. And then usually finishing with, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. Here's our solution, how we're actually going to go after it. If it's done really well, I would say you have some alternative selection and you talk through why you picked the things that you picked instead of just making it a justification for something that you may have already decided way before you did the analysis. But that's a whole other conversation about quality of business cases and how to use them. But we have to think about these 4 components, and we're clearly going to look to fit inside the analysis part of this and the solution part of this as we start to think about a change ROI.
Yeah, so think it's helpful to have a couple of definitions. This is a business case, so we think of it simply as a justification for an initiative and something that needs to be updated as new information comes in, which it always does when you are implementing something. And then change management is the practice of applying a structured approach to transition and organization. And this is from the Standard for Change Management, which was produced in 2014. By the way, there is an update going on with ACMP and the standard. So this is a definition that's been out for a while. I don't think the definition is necessarily going to change, but the standard is being looked at for sure.
Yeah, I want to link back to this because we're trying to find ROI for this component, for what change management is about, but it has to fit back into this business case, right? So it's a justification. Again, even the change management part of the ROI, again, we would think of as a justification. All right, so let's get to the ROI part. You know, how do we actually measure the return on investment for change? And we'll talk a little bit about metrics too, and that kind of leads into some future webinars and writing that Roxanne and I are doing. We'll point you to those so you can see how this fits in there, but we're going to focus in on the ROI. So this is it. This is the equation. These are the elements that we think are valuable. And we're going to both talk through the particulars of this as well as do an example so you can kind of see how it comes together. So we're going to start with the business case. And we'll talk about what do you do if you don't have one, but let's start with, we have a business case. So what's the value of this initiative, specifically around what are people going to do? And then we're going to multiply that looking at the probability of success. So 1 minus the probability of success of doing the initiative without change management, right? So the example that Roxanne likes to use is if you could send an email and everybody just does it and completely adopts and you're all okay, well, then you don't need change management. So if you could literally just push an email and the thing goes and you're good, then fine. And those exist, not very many, but those exist. And so everything else after that's going to be, what's the probability that you'll be successful? And then subtract out the cost of doing the change management. And that's going to give you a dollar value, a numeric value for what is the value of what you're going to get out of this. And if you want to, and many organizations do this, you could take all the same elements and recast them into a ratio. So you do the first couple of elements and then divide those by the cost, and that's going to give you a return on investment. That's going to be a percentage or a ratio, and they're equivalent. So it doesn't matter which one you do, just whatever your organization tends to prefer. So that's the equation. That's how we would suggest you go about doing it. And that's easy enough, and it's nice little pieces there. But of course, as a practical matter, there are some subtleties in there that we have to pay attention to actually do it well. So let's talk a little bit more about where some of those are going to come from by breaking down the individual factors that we have here. So let's start with the business case. So the business case that we're looking at is not the full business case of the entire initiative. We're looking at the part of the business case that is dependent on people. So for example, if you're going to get a cheaper software license just by putting in a new piece of software, and it doesn't matter what the people are doing with it, well, then you get that savings whether or not people are adopting it. So you don't need change management for that. It might be an upgrade. Maybe you upgrade to the next version. People would hardly even notice the change that's there, but for whatever reason, the software manufacturer is going to give you a break on the price. So that does not go in. But most things, as I'm sure you've experienced, are going to go in because there are going to be impacts from people, and that's what the wrapping around this change management thing is going to be all about. In the cases where there is not a business case, the best thing to do is to look for a comparison. So an initiative that is similar in size and scope that's been done in the past that leaders would actually believe is similar and can make that connection back to that initiative, and then use that as a proxy for the business case of the initiative that you've got going on right now. Then we're going to look at the probability of success. And again, you can go back to this idea of how likely is it that people will adopt if you just send an email. So if you go, well, if I send an email, it's not very likely, maybe 20% probability of success, 50% probability of success. That's one way to do it. That can be somewhat difficult for people to conceptualize, like Am I rolling the dice here? What does that really mean? I'm not really sure I understand that. Another way to get to it is just to think about the percentage of people that would actually adopt. So you kick out an email, how many people are just going to do it? So if 10% of the people are going to do it, well, you can use 10%. If 90% of the people will do it, then now you're only chasing after the 10% of the people that will not. And so that might be an easier way to conceptualize it, to kind of think about probability distributions and all that stuff. And then finally, the cost. That's a little bit more straightforward. The big part in here is to be complete and inclusive, right? So there's going to be some analysts there going, well, what about this? What about that? What about the project team that you have, or this part-time project manager that's working for you to do the change? You're going to want to include all of that stuff in there in order for it to be convincing and for people to believe that you really have a true robust measure, and that you're actually capturing all the costs, because that's going to be important for the ROI equation, because we're subtracting that out from the value. Okay, so let's do an example. So here is our semi-fictitious company, Leadership Skyward, and just a little bit about them. Leadership Skyward is an aviation leadership experience company. And what they do is they bring executives together for 2 and 3 day sessions where they talk about decision-making and communication as it's done by pilots in the cockpit, giving them a different way to think about those things. And their hook is that they actually put the executives in the plane and take them flying and make them exercise those skills actually in flight. So putting them in an unusual, maybe even uncomfortable situation for them to go practice these things. So that's our company. And what's going on is there is a change that's happening here. And the CEO has decided to bring everybody back, right? Like lots of other organizations pushed out all the people that could be pushed out from the office. And now he's trying to bring them back. But to facilitate that, he's actually purchased a new hangar, because real estate became cheap. And so there was an opportunity to grab a new hangar. And so there's a move that's happening here. So there are people that are already there moving from one hangar to another. And there's a move for a bunch of people that are going from home back to the hangar to be able to operate. So a pretty important change that a lot of organizations are having to go through, or having to even contemplate, do they want to go through in the past several months, and I'm sure for the next several months as we try and figure all this out. So that's what's going on with this organization. So what we have now is just sort of a basic overview of those 3 main elements that we talked about: the business case, the probability of change success, and the actual cost to do the change management. So in the upper left, the business case, let's say there's 3 big components to it. There's going to be some reduction in costs associated with operating, some reduction in maintenance cost, and some improvement that's going to happen as a result of better sales closing, because the hangar will be shinier and newer and people will be more impressed by what's there. Just go with that as what's happening here. So we can't include all 3 of those elements, because the reduction in the building cost, that happens no matter what. Right. So if you're getting a cheaper mortgage because you're going from one to another, it doesn't have anything to do with the people. But reduction in maintenance costs because of how you bring the planes in and fix them, because of the facility that's there, and how do the maintainers actually use it. Changes that go on in the sales because of how the salespeople are using it. Those are people dependent. And so those matter. So we won't include all of it in the change management part, but we will include the 4.4 million that's there. And then we'll look at the probability of success. We're just going to ask the question we're going to ask. And for the purposes of this, we're going to say that the likelihood is high, 70%. And that's mostly just to show you that the numbers work out and you're going to get a positive ROI for it. I would say 70% is probably kind of high. You guys might think the same thing. You're going to tell a bunch of people they got to go from home, come back to their place of work and move into a new building, and you're going to say 70% of them are going to do it and it's all going to be fine, no problem. That seems very optimistic to me. So I think this is, an appropriately pessimistic way to show the calculation, by thinking that, wow, change, we don't need that much of it. And then lastly, just the costs. And you see a list in here from the person doing it to project manager, people engaged, all that kind of stuff as we go through.
So a question we got is the cost net new hires, or is it also including estimated cost of using existing staff?
So that's a great question. So if I would look to include everyone, right? So even if people are already there and you're paying their salary, you can make an argument, well, that's a sunk cost, so we don't want to put it in here. But I think you need to put that in order to get a true view as to what the change effort is going to do. If you're going to push those costs out, then to be consistent, you would really need to do that across the entire project. And that tends to hide what you're really doing in order to pull it all together. And then so resource cost of the total project. Now I'm thinking resource cost of just in this round, just our change management. I'm going to show you how we want to go back then to look at the resource cost for the entire project. But in this thing, we're looking solely at the effort to conduct the change management part of it. So absent any work that might be going on to clean up the building, fix up what's going on before you move in, spruce up the landscaping. You can imagine a whole bunch of other things that are going on that are not change management related that would go in there. So we'll deal with these right now, and then I think I'll touch on some of what you're asking for here as we'll expand back out and look at the entire effort altogether. So if we take this and kind of use our simple example and just lay the numbers in that we just talked about, the overall business case that matters for people is 4.4 million. We're saying there was a 70% probability of success. We're going to subtract that from 1 because that's the part that we're actually paying attention to. The 7% of the people, they're adopting whether we show up or not. It's the 30% of the people that won't adopt. Those are the ones that we need to go pay attention to. And then we subtract out the cost of change management. And you can see in this example, even with a 70% probability, you end up with a positive ROI. And if you want to take that and just cut it in half, just to get rid of the people that might be naysayers out there and go, yeah, but your numbers are squishy, or I don't believe that, or whatever. And just say, fine. So we'll take half of it, 215K. Well, that's a positive ROI. If you have a positive ROI and the project itself is already positive, if you get a positive ROI for change management, then it's worth doing. Like you're contributing, because if you don't do that, then you're not getting some of the value of the business case, because at least 30% of the people in this example are not going to jump in and are not going to go through the change. So you're not getting the business value from them. And so that is a pretty straightforward way to at least show that the basic change management effort itself has a positive ROI. But, as some of you, I'm sure, are thinking, that's a little too simple, right? There are other considerations in there, and I would call them interaction effects, right? So there are others that are contributing to the initiative. It's not just the change management people that are making it go. Other people are making the entire initiative go. And some of the ROI may be due to some of their work. So the way out of that is to zoom back out again and now look at the entire effort. So we want to essentially recalculate the business case ROI of the entire change effort. And I'm going to look at this simply. I'm not going to go into all the details of things that you might want to pay attention to here, but just to give you a simplistic view of this, which I think is sufficient. So I say simplistic, that means global. I'm taking out the subtleties, but that also means that it's probably a more pessimistic view, which means that if you get a positive value, you've got a stronger case that this is worthwhile. So what we want to do is zoom out and look at now the full business case, all elements, whether they're people driven or not. Subtract out the cost of change management, and now subtract out all of the costs. So the total project costs that are on top of that, and see again if you get a positive ROI. And again, if your organization does a ratio, you can flip it and put the costs into the denominator and turn it into a percentage. And those are equivalent ways to do the calculation. So in our case, if we go through and do this, now we're up to 5.9, the full value of it. Subtract out the cost of change management, subtract out the other costs that are there. And again, we get back to a positive ROI. So you're just checking to make sure that by adding in the cost of change management, you didn't push the initiative negative somehow, because you are adding in potentially other effort in here, other costs. And so that's a reasonable concern and useful to be able to say, nope, here's the calculation. We're still good. We still have this as a positive. But there are other pieces in here too, and that is around risk. And so I want to talk a little bit about this. And this is something that Roxanne really developed. She mentioned this at the beginning, working with an analytic group. And how do you talk about change management with a bunch of analysts? So let her
Yeah.
describe that.
I imagine some of you do this already, if not all of you, where you talk about risk, change in terms of risk. One of the things that I learned to do in the analytic world was sort of like what if scenarios and come up with almost scenario planning and what is the likelihood of these scenarios playing out. Once people can imagine these scenarios, they can pretty quickly determine which ones they're most concerned about and which ones are most likely to show up if there isn't some work around the people related risk. So we talk a lot about the risk associated with change management. We talk about the opportunities too, but where we get the real traction is when we talk about the risk of it. Once we can assure people that we're going to address the risk adequately, then we entertain the idea of, well, what could we accomplish here? What are the opportunities kind of going on the opposite end of the spectrum?
Yeah, and so before we get much further into that, we've created an ROI guide. So I'll just put that in the chat for you. You're welcome to download that. It kind of gives a walkthrough of just what we just talked about, a little bit more detail in there with some examples about how to go about doing it. But that's something that you can reach out, just get for free off of our website and be able to pull that in as really a way to think about how to do this whole thing. So continuing on then with what Roxana put together, we want to think now through what's a way for us to think about the sort of interplay between risk and the return on investment that might be there. And this is a way that we like to think about it. So we're looking at two dimensions here. What's the risk of just staying where you are, status quo? Is it low or high? That's what's on the bottom. And then what's the risk to actually execute this thing? Is it low or high? Think about that as difficulty, reputation risk, anything that you could possibly think of that might go into putting the initiative together. So we would look at something that's going to give you, has a high risk of the staying where you are, but it's relatively low risk to execute. That's sort of an obvious one, like go do those, the ones that are in green, because it's not that hard to do and you want to run out there and go after it. It's these ones in the upper right that start to become more tricky, right? So it's pretty high risk to execute and also a high risk to stay where you are. Daryl Connor talks about developing a burning platform. We think that's appropriate for these. And even John Cotter talks about generating or creating a sense of urgency, which is great, except it's really tough to go create a sense of urgency for everything, right? That I think is where you do get some of this change resistance and even burnout from change efforts, is because your people are constantly hammering, we got to do this, we got to do this, and they just don't, no one's going to believe that for everything. It's appropriate when you're in the upper right, but probably not for the other three quadrants. So just kind of continuing to thinking through this, you may have something that's really hard to execute, but you could probably live with it. Like you think of the risk to the status quo, it's not that high. Now, as you have probably experienced, those things are fine, and then all of a sudden they're not. So the risk of the status quo might be fine right now, might not be so much so in the future, but it can be difficult to predict that. And we like to think of those as more optimization and think about the risk that you're trying to take on and how you're handling it as an optimization effort, as compared to what you're doing in the upper right for the orange, whereas like something bad is going to happen or already is, and we need to take action on it. And then finally, the group that's in the bottom left, these opportunistic ones, that's when it's not that risky to go execute it, but it's also not that risky to go do it. So those are the ones that can potentially be pushed away in favor of others. But what we would advocate is that those get brought into the portfolio because they're easier to do and they provide some relief from the constant hammering that's there. And so one of the ways out of the change resistance or change saturation is to think about the portfolio of initiatives that are here across these two dimensions of risk and lay them out across the timeline for when things would be done, so that you're not burning people out, having them do the most difficult, most risky things, but instead having a portfolio that spreads out what's going on with all of those. And so if you want to think about this a little further, the ones on the left I would think of as the ones you're doing proactively. Something bad isn't happening right now. You're trying to make an improvement or prevent something bad from happening in the future. The ones on the right, you're probably more reactive. Like the staying where you are is bad. You've probably crossed over to a place where bad things are already starting to happen, or you're starting to see cost increase, customer complaints, whatever it is. And then you can simplify all these and just think of them as easy and hard as well, the upper and the lower. And that maybe is a better way to go about trying to describe it to someone than these two risk dimensions. But the risk dimensions are important. And I think you guys want to pay attention to those as you're leading through a change initiative. When Roxanne and I were just chatting in our own history about these, where our projects landed, they sort of showed up on this dotted line. So this is by no means scientific, right? This is not, we haven't done a data poll. This is just our two sets of experiences coming together here. But we didn't find that many things that we thought of in the very bottom left or the very bottom right. If they were more in the easy, they tended to clump more in the middle. And the ones that we did that were in that harder region tended to be really, really risky in the status quo in the far upper right, or more in the far upper left. We just wasn't a big push to have to get on off of whatever was going on. And the risk to actually execute it was relatively high. And those can be tricky to be able to make the case that you ought to go do them. And so thinking about them as this is our optimization and setting ourselves up for the future, as opposed to this is an emergency, we need to go fix it now, which is more what's going on in the upper right, might be useful. We just offer that to you as a way to start to think about it, because telling the story around all of this is really going to matter. It's going to be quite important.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, there, as a change professional, you might find yourself in the situation where you're looking for what is the big why behind what we're doing. And sometimes it can be hard to find that big why, especially if it turns out you're more on that proactive, side of the equation, as opposed to, the burning platform part. But when you can categorize it this way and then ask the question, well, what if we don't do it over time? Will there be a situation where we end up being in this reactive place if we don't take the proactive now? That can help with positioning the importance of it with your audience, with leadership, with whomever, so that they can see, oh yeah, we do this now to avoid the reaction later. And some cultures prefer, the firefighting thing. Yeah. You probably are familiar with that. But that is a way to try to get to, hey, we're preventing something bad from happening later, or being in this emergency situation later.
So that's our thoughts around that. So as just a quick replay, you need to get the ROI first, right? So before we get over here, if you don't have a positive ROI, there's no point in talking about this stuff, right? So you got to figure out how to make that positive first. And now you're thinking about, all right, what's my portfolio? When I have a whole bunch of different ROI positive initiatives, how do I set my portfolio up to be able to handle all of this? So Josh asked, so we're able to give an example of a project where it falls on this. I'll give you a couple quick ones, Josh. So Roxanne and I did a project where we were looking at doing a significant process and a system replacement that in particular was for a branch network. And they were running on two older systems that were not going to be supported by the manufacturer anymore. One of those systems was still green screen driven, if you can imagine that such a thing exists. This is not decades ago. This is relatively recent. So this thing still exists and it's out there. And so you can imagine taking just the technical work to take those things out is difficult. The change work is also hard because you get 10,000 tellers that have memorized how to work these things, and they've put all this effort in to make it happen. And we're going to take all that away and give them a whole new system. And even though it's shiny, new, and useful, that's a big change for them to take on. So we couldn't stay where we were, but the executing against this was really difficult. In the upper left corner, a similar sort of also a bank initiative that we had was working in the core technical bank system. So everything was working, right? There wasn't anything bad going on. Nothing was falling apart. But there weren't the opportunities to make improvements, kept getting limited. We couldn't optimize as much as we wanted to on the system. And that is a gigantic, very difficult thing to do. But there just wasn't that much risk to the status quo. And in fact, for years, that initiative had just gotten pushed off and pushed off.
Yeah.
Right? Just the executives were like, we don't have to do that. Because there's nothing pushing them to do it. And so when they finally got to the place where we recognized, okay, yeah, we're okay, but maybe someday we won't be. And it really is time to do the optimization. That's an example of one that's more in the upper left. So hopefully that helps to kind of just give you a view of how to think about all of those. Okay, so the last piece then is, how do we tell the story about this, right? Because you can go through and do a bunch of calculations and throw stuff at people, and that can work. But even better is if you can tell a great data story so that the decision to bring in change management and to use this becomes obvious. It's just easier to take on. We're not trying to bamboozle anybody. We're just trying to make it clear for them, what does the data actually tell us? And what I would suggest then is to use something like this, a waterfall chart. And if you're not familiar, I'll just kind of walk you through a bit of this. Really what we're doing here is we're working left to right across the page. We're starting off with the full business case. So what's all the value that we get, the value part of the business case. And then what we're doing is we're subtracting out the components. So you see the little lines on there lower, the two red ones, the project management and technology that would go on for driving it. And this yellow orangish one, which is the change management piece. Think of those as the costs that are associated with it. So what's left on the right in the brown bar is the value that you get, the return that you get expressed as in currency, dollars or whatever currency you're working in, on what's going on. And that chart by itself can really tell the entire story about what's going on. You put all the components together in there and you've been able to make it happen. And I made this in Excel, right? So this is an out of the box, straightforward Excel chart, nothing fancy at all. It took 2 minutes to put together and then I pasted it into this PowerPoint slide. So this is not difficult to do. And you can set these things up, and then just to make it pretty, I went and clicked on the colors so you could get some different colors, but that's it. And so there's nothing particularly difficult about doing this. And you can, if you want some help, can Google how to do this pretty easily. The next piece then, and we won't go through an example of this, but we'll at least describe it to you, is to do a sensitivity analysis. So the first thing that an analyst is going to do to try and poke holes in what you put together is go, well, I don't believe the individual point numbers. What happens if this number goes up by 10% or that number goes down by 20%? And that's a reasonable thing to ask, right? That is typical thing for people to do as a sensitivity analysis in any kind of analytical setup. And it'll allow you to be able to walk through and show what limits do you need to go to. So for an example, like if the probability of the change, we use 70% was pretty high. Well, if the probability of that goes to 99%, you're probably not going to get a positive ROI out of it, right? Because people are going to adopt whether you show up or not. And it is easy enough then to say, well, you don't need change management. And so adding in costs is going to push the ROI down. So you can think about some of those things. Maurice, thanks for throwing the link in there. So I'm sure there are others out there. And if you guys want some help with that, please send us an email. I'm happy to point you if whatever you're finding out there isn't doing it for you. But you can definitely look to make waterfall charts and also create sensitivity analysis around those things.
Yeah, and we have we have a tutorial on the sensitivity analysis, walks you through step by step on the Excel. So we can put it out on our web page that shows the recordings of the webinar. So you can take a look at that if you're interested.
so all that kind of pulls together into metrics, and we're not going to go into this now. We'll actually do, you may have seen at the beginning, we'll be doing more webinars that lead into metrics. So we'll talk about influencers and how to do surveys, and we'll talk about a whole metric stack, but this fits into that idea. And so the way we think about it, as you can see, is in these three different levels of self-reported and observable and existing metrics, and have those in there to be able to pull all those different elements. So this ROI is about that, and we're really driving towards actionable insights. So that's what we're trying to get to with all of the analytics that we're chasing after here. And we have put all of that into this set of classes that are bundled together as part of our change analytics concentration. So just to quickly tell you how this is set up, we have all of the material is all recorded. So once you log in, you're in and you have access to everything, all the tools that are in there and all of the recordings that describe those tools and describe the concepts. And what we just talked about and the depth to go into sensitivity analysis is part of it. But in addition to that are these four other areas. So how to use social network analysis to be able to understand who the influencers are, how to actually put together a truly impactful survey, and then how to analyze it, how to yank all that together to create a full change metrics approach, and then finally how to do the presentation that's actually persuasive. In addition to that, every other month, we do a live session. We're always on Fridays, and we have a case. And so once you've completed the class, you show up for whichever live session you want to show up. Come to several if you want. And we'll go through the case, and it's an opportunity for you to try all this stuff out. So I put the link in to the chat. And if you have a moment, check it out. Just see what you think about what's there. You'll see that all of these topics that we have here, these are the topics that we'll be doing in future webinars. So we touch on each of these areas, but this really goes into depth and is very much about actually executing the tools to do it. All those tools are Excel based, so nothing fancy and nothing that you need to buy, all off the shelf stuff that will allow you to do it. And this is part of the 3 classes that we've got from our change certification to the one that we've got set up for leaders, and then this one diving much more into analytics. And then that just brings us back to this whole idea about joy at work and how we're making all of that happen. And you can check out this guide that we put together on how to go about using what we've learned to actually drive and grow joy at work. And Roxanne just put that in the chat for you. So you can go out to a description that we've got of what are these dimensions, and there's some exercises in there to help you to actually be able to go do this stuff as well and apply that in your own company.
Yeah, and it's good for impact assessment work. And then it's also just good for like team engagement, especially if you're working on a project team. The culture of the team, absolutely matters, as we all know.
So you can see all those items on the left-hand side that I talked about. In a couple of weeks, we'll be doing our next webinar, which will be in the Change Leadership Series, and talking about how you get your team together to actually help you go lead the change. And this is based on a lot of the work that Roxanne has done over the time where she was an internal change practitioner, and we pulled that together now into a bit of a package so that you can help you to apply it in your own companies.
Yeah, this one is, we get this question a lot. You might get this question too. How do I get my team to lead change? They won't take ownership. They won't be leaders and lead the change. So that's where that comes from. That's what we'll focus on.
All right, and that's it for us. So thank you all very much. We've got a minute or two left, and Roxanne and I will hang out. But here's how you can get in touch with us. And if you have any questions, please, if you want to come off mute and let us know, or throw something in the chat, happy to answer any questions or hear any thoughts that you guys have about what we talked about today.
Yeah, thank you for the comments and the questions.